Hi, this is Travis, and this is a presentation that I'm going to be giving at the ASHRAE Orange County chapter on March 26th of 2026. So it's called Why and How Healthcare Ventilation Must Change. Um, and the presentation is really me telling a story about healthcare ventilation, and it's very much my story. I've spent the last dozen or so years in the middle of this conversation around healthcare ventilation. I think what I've learned is from that experience is uncomfortable, but also unavoidable. In my opinion, the current state of healthcare ventilation is not okay. And I also think that the story has some larger morals. What happens when an engineering rule set accumulates authority without accountability? And what is it that we risk when we fail to advance our thinking? So healthcare ventilation occupies this strange place within ASHRAE and HVAC engineering. We insist that healthcare is different. We use air changes per hour instead of the contaminant-based models. We have these preset and narrow temperature ranges rather than using the comfort models that everybody else uses. We have this strong emphasis on room-to-room pressure relationships that almost no other building type uses, or at least uses to the extent that we do. We also have filters that are way more efficient than other commercial spaces, and we ventilate at these relatively extremely high ventilation rates, seemingly ignoring the energy consequences of doing so. And that difference is often framed as something that's necessary, right? As though aerosol contamination in hospitals is governed by some other set of laws of physics. But that notion doesn't hold up at all. Air quality is air quality, and comfort is comfort, and energy is energy. So the engineering problems are not different. What's really different is our history. And I think if the story of healthcare ventilation could provide one lesson to the rest of the industry, it would be this: don't oversell ventilation. What do I mean by that? Well, for the last 50 years, from like the 1970s to the 2010s, you could go back and pull the HVAC trade journals, the ASHRAE Journal and the other trade journals, and you'd find 4 or 5 articles a year on the topic of healthcare ventilation. If you pulled out all of those articles and you read like the first paragraph, the opening paragraph of those articles, you'd find some pretty awesome ideas. Healthcare ventilation is supposed to prevent disease transmission. It's supposed to be the solution for hospital-acquired infections, or the solution for infection control, or good ventilation can improve recovery times for patients. That one always makes me laugh, by the way. I had a niece that had a bad car accident. Like, she broke a bunch of bones and was in the hospital for like 18 days. So I try to imagine some HVAC salesman giving a presentation saying, hey, with better air conditioning, like we could reduce her stay time by 20%, which is totally bogus. I hope we can all agree that that's totally bogus. So here's the thing, right? Imagine that you go out and you spend $1,000 on one of these air quality sensor arrays, right? And then you take this thing and you go on a tour around Los Angeles today. Take it to some schools, some office buildings, some churches, some restaurants, some houses, some hotels, and then take it to a hospital. What you're going to see is that the hospital wins. The cleanest air you're going to find in the city is in the hospitals. And by the way, it's right when you walk in the door. You walk through the front door of the hospital and you just entered a space with a ton of outside air ventilation, a ton of total ventilation, and it's all treated with two-pass filtration, very often MERV 14 or MERV 16. So the air in there is clean. In fact, if you have one of those little desktop personal IAQ meters, a PM 2.5 meter, or one of the wearable PM 2.5 meters, and you take it into a hospital, it will zero out, or you'll get a reading of like 1 or 2 micrograms or something like that. And yet, I've been at Kaiser for 15 years, and we are constantly targeted for more IAQ products and protocols. Every single new vendor who's selling a filter or an air purifier or a UV system or whatever it is, they all go after healthcare. I think they all call me personally. And the sales pitch is always the same. Healthcare is where we can reduce infections and prevent disease transmission and stop infection control and improve recovery times, heal broken bones, apparently, right? And all of that gets said and believed. Some of the salespeople out there are very earnest. So it gets said and believed without ever giving a single thought to how clean or how over clean the air already is. And that type of thinking doesn't do anybody good. It starts to get into false benefits that you can't really make good on. So let's go back and look at how dilution works, like the basic contamination dilution equation and how it works. It's conservation of mass. We learned that in college. We have a source of contamination in a room and a rate of contaminants per minute. Then we bring in air, which is either uncontaminated or has a much lower contamination density to dilute those contaminants. It's a steady state equation. Sidebar, you could argue that some healthcare scenarios, like a sneeze, are not steady state problems, and you would be correct. But that's way too smart. The way that our air quality codes and standards and all of our equations in our textbooks are written, this is a steady state problem, right? So with this framework, it makes sense. The higher the ventilation number, the lower the resultant concentration. And you can take the equation and produce a curve that looks like the curve that you see right here on the screen, right? Now, here's the rub. The placement of that curve moves up and down based on the contaminant generation rate. So, and spoiler alert, you're going to see these curves later on in the slide deck. It's not that this model that we have, this model that's in our head and in our textbooks, it's not that this model is wrong. It's just that the whole model, the whole relationship is proportional to the rate of contamination generation in the space, right? Now I got into this thing through energy. My own path into this whole conversation was energy. U.S. hospitals use extraordinary amounts of energy. We use 2 to 4 times more energy per square foot than other commercial buildings. And then we also use about twice, sometimes a little more than twice, the energy of our international peers. So you look at the energy consumption of hospitals in Germany and Switzerland and France, and they use significantly less than us. And as well, you look at other commercial buildings in the United States, they're using significantly less than what we do. And it is actually interesting, within the United States, the hospital energy is largely weather independent. There have been comparative studies, Heather Burpie's work, for example, that looked at hospitals in very different climates and found that the energy use is remarkably similar. So hospitals in Phoenix, Arizona and Fargo, North Dakota have largely similar energy signatures. I'm going to show you more on that. First off, though, it's important for us as HVAC engineers to know that most of the energy that's in a hospital is HVAC related, right? I would love to tell you that hospitals use a lot of energy because there's a lot of medical equipment in there, and therefore the energy in hospitals is going like directly to the end of serving patients, but nothing could be further from the truth. At least 2/3, and often quite a bit more of the energy that we use in hospitals is HVAC related. It's caused by our HVAC systems, or it's used by our HVAC systems. And as I mentioned, it is largely unrelated to weather. So let me show you what I mean by unrelated to weather. This is what we do with our monthly energy bills. What you're seeing here are monthly natural gas bills and monthly electrical bills from one of our hospitals. Happens to be the West Los Angeles Hospital. Why is it West Los Angeles? Because that's the data that I had. But what you're seeing here is you're seeing a couple years worth of data. And what we do is we separate statistically. We can tell how much electricity is what we call base electricity, how much natural gas is what we call base natural gas. That's the natural gas that we use all year long, whether it's winter or summer, the electricity that we use all year long, whether it's winter or summer. And then we have the weather-related component. That's the component where it varies based on, for the heating side, heating degree days, and for the cooling side, cooling degree days in the month, right? So the blue rectangle that you see here is the base energy use, and then the orange shape that you see there is the weather-related shape. And of course, in this one, we can look at like how much of the electrical is base electrical, how much of the natural gas is base. And for this hospital, it happens to be that 89% of the energy usage is base and not related to weather, and 10%, 11% of the energy use is base and not related to weather. That is very common. That's very typical for our hospitals. We have some that are even worse than that, where we're in the territory of like 95% of the energy usage is non-weather related energy use, right? And while that strikes in the face of the law of thermodynamics that you and I learned as HVAC engineers, it's also not a mystery. Like, we know exactly why this happens, right? It is a direct consequence of a ventilation paradigm that's built around fixed air change rates. Once you have fixed air change rates per hour as your governing logic, then you have high continuous ventilation year round. That becomes normal, and it just leads to this massive energy bill that has nothing to do with the weather, right? So whether you're interested in climate change or the economics of energy or just the cost of healthcare, there is a real cost to this energy signature of hospitals, right? It does real harm. So that should lead us to the question, right? Where do these numbers come from and why are we still using them, right? The most common number that you even see on the screen here is the minimum outdoor air changes per hour in about 80% of the spaces that we see on this screen here is 2 air changes per hour, right? What is 2 air changes per hour, and why are we using 2 air changes per hour? Well, 2 air changes per hour can be traced all the way back to Florence Nightingale's work in overcrowded unsanitary wards in the Crimean War, right? 100 square foot per bed, 1,000 to 1,500 cubic foot per bed, 2,000 to 3,000 cubic foot per bed per hour, i.e. 2 air changes per hour. And you can find that in the architectural literature of the 1860s and 1870s. And look, 2 air changes per hour made sense in this context. What does not make sense is that we are still using that number, literally unchanged, the exact same number in modern hospitals that look absolutely nothing like this. So how did that happen? Well, over time, the narrative standards became tables. So we kept the numbers, but we erased the reasoning. And then those tables migrated. First, they were government standards. Then they became industry standards. It went through the American Institute of Architects, and then it went to the Facilities Guideline Institute. And then finally, they became the standards published by ASHRAE 170. The same numbers, just changed ownership over the years. And so these numbers have gained authority without ever acquiring a rationale or gaining some evidence, right? And so if you ask the smartest people, if you go and find the top experts on ASHRAE 170, the smartest folks on ASHRAE 170, like, hey, why do we use 2 air changes per hour in healthcare spaces? The best answer that you'll get is, we've been using that number for 50 years, and we just can't imagine using anything else. We don't know what else to use. That's the best answer that you'll get. It's the most honest answer that you'll get, and technically speaking, it's the best answer that you get. And listen, it's a shitty answer. It is a shitty answer. So longevity has substituted for technical integrity. 2 air changes per hour, 4 air changes per hour, 6 air changes per hour. These are technically indefensible numbers, but they have gained authority over time. And so this is where the story separates between healthcare and non-healthcare, right? Outside of healthcare, in the parallel story of ASHRAE Standard 62, we've seen ventilation standards evolve. They evolved technically and transparently. The numbers changed, the processes have changed. Not to date myself too much, but in my time we saw some significant technical updates. 1999, 2004. We also saw some updates in 2007 and 2013, 2019, etc., right? And while this is not a standard 62.1 presentation, I do want to take a moment here and point out the IAQP, the Indoor Air Quality Procedure. This actually first appeared in ASHRAE 62 in 1981 as a performance methodology to determine indoor air quality and compliance, but it wasn't very mature, and it did not include this list of contaminant thresholds. In fact, this list of contaminant thresholds may be the most argued about thing in standard 62.1, but it's in there now as of 2022 in the current version of 62.1, we have this table of 14 contaminants. So what does air quality look like? What does quality indoor air look like? Well, it looks like this. If I take a sample of the air from this room and I put it in a bottle and I take it to a lab, I can check it against these numbers and get a yes or no answer. That is actually a huge technological advancement in indoor air quality. So what are these contaminants? Probably for most of us in these rooms, we've never heard of these things. And if you're so inclined, I would urge you to take a morning and spend a morning with Google looking up these contaminants. They are not there by accident, I assure you. There are a few of them with specific risks that are related to cooking, printing, copying, certain cleaning products, furniture and paint and off-gassing. There are a few of these that are actually outdoor contaminants like ozone and carbon monoxide. I will point out that PM 2.5, the level there is 9 micrograms. The outdoor air today, as I'm recording this, actually meets that. But in my region, we do get up to about 15 at certain times of the year. And so that classic MERV 8 filter, if it's working right and installed right, would get you there. You'll also notice that CO2 is not on this list. That's an astute observation. Congratulations for noting that. There's a long conversation behind that. And of course, this IAQ procedure is still very clunky to use. To work on a project with a city plan checker to demonstrate compliance using this process, like that's not going to be simple. It's not going to be clean or easy, but it exists. And the fact that it exists is really important as we move into the future. But inside healthcare, our numbers stayed the same, right? And more importantly, in healthcare is the culture. The culture of questioning these numbers became blasphemous. So we developed this strong status quo authoritarian conservatism, right? My favorite story about this is that I went to a meeting of ASHRAE 170, and I think it was in about 2015, right? And we were talking about medical office buildings, clinical spaces. And I told the committee, I said, hey, listen, when we build our clinical spaces, these are B occupancy buildings. We don't use the air change tables. We just do, 15 CFM a person. And there's no total, we're not doing 2 air changes per hour in the exam rooms or 6 air changes per hour in the exam room. Nobody builds that way. That's not how we do those buildings. And this one guy, the original, Rick Hermans was his name. He's the original founding chairman of Standard 170 in ASHRAE. He looks me dead in the eyes and he goes, Travis, how many people are you willing to kill? And I was like, whoa, that got dark really fast. I don't even know how I responded. I've very infrequently been accused of genocide, throughout my career. So I don't think I responded well. And I think that as I've thought about that story over the years, I don't think that guy actually believed that people were going to die if you don't use 6 air changes per hour in the exam rooms. I think what he wanted was he wanted to defend the integrity of the table. He wanted to see me published publicly, for daring to question the integrity of the table. And that is more scary than the idea of, actually thinking that somebody's going to die based on 6 air changes per hour. Okay, so what happens when we start looking for evidence in the real world, right? So for example, in hospital spaces, do higher air changes actually produce better air quality? Well, we had the chance to test this. This project started in about 2017, and it did happen in a Kaiser hospital, working with the California Energy Commission. We instrumented a live hospital tower with more than 70 sensor banks, capturing millions of individual data points, temperature, humidity, CO2, VOCs, ozone, particle concentrations. And we paired those measurements to the CFMs, converted to air changes, while doing a VAV conversion. So that allowed us to evaluate real air quality against real ventilation rates. The study included patient rooms, a whole bunch of non-patient areas under VAV conditions. It was then and remains today the largest data set of indoor air quality collected in a hospital, a U.S. hospital. And I always have to say this really loud and clear. It did not include the ORs or the isolation rooms. So this is sort of everywhere else in the hospital outside of the operating rooms. And here's what we actually found with the data. Right? Across every contaminant category that we could compare, for general indoor air quality, CO2s and particles and VOC. Anytime the ventilation was higher than 2 air changes per hour, the air in the space was basically the same level of cleanliness. So increasing ventilation to 6 air changes and 10 air changes or even 12 air changes produced no measurable improvement in the steady state contamination levels. In fact, the contaminant concentrations that we got clustered very tightly within these narrow bands across all the samples, regardless of whether the spaces was at 2 air changes or 12 air changes. You can kind of see that in the chart there, right? For CO2, basically everything was sitting between 400 and 600 parts per million, right? And it didn't matter what space it was or what the ventilation rate was. You just always saw that cluster in the data, which, by the way, is almost the margin of error on the sensor, right? And so what's actually going on here? I told you that that these curves would be coming back later on in the presentation. So as we were presenting this data around the country, we had this analogy that we used to explain it. The analogy goes like this. If you take 1 shower per day, well, that's useful in keeping you clean and controlling odor. I have a teenage son, and for him, taking 2 showers per day is still useful in keeping clean and controlling odor. But if any of us here were to take 10 or 12 showers per day, well, then at that point, we're just wasting water, right? We're just blowing water down the drain. The rate of contamination can't keep up with the rate of cleaning. We're over cleaning for the rate of contamination. And the same is true for background contamination in hospital spaces. Obviously, there is background contamination happening in hospitals, but our ventilation systems are just completely overpowering them to a ridiculous degree. Even when we reduced some of the administrative areas down to 1/4 of an air change, you can see those points on this slide. So even when we reduced down to 1/4 of an air change, the air quality remains stable. And of course, no shock, this project showed radical energy savings, right? In the study zones, we saw 25% reduction in natural gas, 35% reduction in electricity, with literally 0 impact on the indoor environment quality. So 0 impact on patient safety or staff safety or anything like that, right? That's not the only study. Here's another study that ASHRAE took on. So this was an ASHRAE research project, and it was called Academic Research to Determine the Evidence Basis of the Ventilation Requirements. It was co-sponsored with ASHRAE and with FGI. And so ASHRAE set out to determine the scientific basis of the numbers in Standard 170. And the findings were terrible, right? The research team cataloged 887 requirements in Standard, and then they reviewed more than 1,000 studies and articles and papers. And what they found is that the overwhelming majority of the ventilation requirements in our standard have no rational basis, no clinical basis, and no available empirical evidence. 75% of the requirements showed no evidence whatsoever. 20% were merely rational inclusion, meaning the consensus of experts rather than having any data. And this is for all of the requirements in the standard: temperatures, pressures, air changes, all the requirements in the standard. For the air change rates, which is the part of the standard with the biggest energy footprint, the results were even worse. So 95% of the air change rates lacked any defensible scientific or rational foundation, because as we've already seen, it's just a bunch of circular references. We've been repeating the same numbers over and over and over for sometimes 150 years. So then there's been even more research. This is another project. 2 guys in ASHRAE that I know, these guys, Fred Betts and Isan Musavi, are leading a big data project into operating rooms. So what they're doing is they're collecting test and balance data from 513 operating rooms across 45 different hospitals in 4 states, and they compare that airflow data back to the public surgical site infection records. Pause there, because you may not know this. In 10 states in the United States, hospitals are required to publish their surgical site infection rates by site. So if your mom is going to have surgery in a local hospital, you can go to the state of California website and look up the surgery infection rates in that hospital and compare them to other hospitals in the state. So It's public data. So these guys are taking that public data, and then in addition to that, hospitals are required to get air balance reports on their ORs once per year. And so they're putting that into this huge data set, right? What are the air changes? What's the pressurization? How does that line up with the surgical site infections? Yeah? And what have they found? Well, they found a big bunch of scatter plots, right? But the bottom line here is that there is no statistically significant correlation between air changes per hour. So for example, 15 air changes versus 20 air changes and surgical site infection rate. The one that I've highlighted here is normalized surgical site infection rate. So that is to say, it is not true, statistically speaking, that operating rooms with 20 air changes have fewer infections than operating rooms with 15 air changes. It is also not true, statistically speaking, that operating rooms with more positive pressure have fewer infections than operating rooms with less positive pressure, right? The point here is that when you start testing our healthcare ventilation ideas in the real world, the basic premises start to fail. And they actually fail kind of fast and hard. So we use this table of air change rates and these OR rules to teach about healthcare ventilation really for my entire lifetime. And the basic premises of that don't hold up to the first level of scrutinization. And I say that's because we failed to modernize our thinking in 50 years' time. So then what happened? Well, then we had a pandemic, a pandemic involving an aerosol virus. So this is my least favorite picture from COVID-19. I want us to take a pause here and take a look at what's going on. This is in a Kaiser facility. It's in Riverside. And what we have there is a HEPA filter unit in a patient room. And the HEPA filter unit is taking air and pushing it outside of the building. So we're taking air, conditioned air, running it through a HEPA filter, and then dumping it towards the 91 freeway. Now, just so we're all on the same page here, HEPA filters were developed during the Manhattan Project to remove nuclear beta particles from the air, and they do that, and they do it well. So even if the air upstream of your HEPA filter is a nuclear reactor, the air coming out of the HEPA filter is clean. So we have a device here that can create some of the cleanest air on planet Earth, and we're wasting it. We're literally dumping it to the 91 freeway. Why the hell would we do this? Well, there's a really good reason why we did this. The reason we did this is because ASHRAE told us to. In March of 2020, ASHRAE and ASHE held a webinar. There was like 500 facilities engineers on this webinar. And they told people that the single most important thing to do was create negative pressure rooms. Negative pressure, negative pressure, negative pressure. They showed these diagrams, one of which is exactly what that photo shows. Take a HEPA filter scrubber and use it as an exhaust fan and point it out the window, to create a negative pressure room, because negative pressure is more important than clean air, right? Wrong. But we did this because ASHRAE told us to. The real question is, why did ASHRAE tell us to do this? And the reason that ASHRAE told us to do this is because we didn't have a technical framework for thinking through an air contamination problem. And so we made a bonehead mistake. That is, by the way, putting HEPA filtered air out the window towards the 91 freeway is a bonehead mistake. It is an amateur mistake, right? Now, the best thinkers during the pandemic, and I guess arrogantly I'm putting myself in that category, started looking at risk modeling and contamination control scenarios. By the way, once you start looking at infectious aerosol risk modeling, the answer comes screaming right out of the models. HEPA filters are a source control strategy. They're down there towards the bottom of the list. Negative pressure is a containment strategy. By itself, negative pressure doesn't really offer any protection in the room. It protects the guy in the hallway and doesn't protect anybody in the room. So the answer here is pretty simple, and it's a lot cheaper, by the way. You just put the HEPA filter in the room, or better yet, you put a local capture device with like an 80-90% capture rate through a HEPA filter and discharge that into the room. Those options come out of the model with great performance, and they're a whole lot cheaper, by the way. Under ASHRAE 241, which is going to come out 3 years later in this little story, that's the answer, right? What's scary here, and it is scary, by the way, is that ASHRAE 170 and ASHRAE acted like leaders should act. They acted quickly. They acted decisively. They held this webinar in March of 2020. That is quick, decisive action. They issued clear-cut directions in the early months of the pandemic. That's what you want your technical leaders to do. But unfortunately, the clear-cut direction that they issued was wrong. It is technically indefensible. That top option, just like 2 air changes per hour and 6 air changes per hour in the patient room, that is a technically indefensible solution. But it was issued by an authority. Jonathan Flannery, voting member of ASHRAE 170. Michael Sheeran, chairman of ASHRAE 170, right? So COVID was not just a crisis. It was a validation test. And we failed it. We failed it badly. This takes us to ASHRAE Standard 241, control of infectious aerosols. This standard is out now. It came out in 2023. It was developed using state-of-the-art infectious aerosol risk modeling simulators. And those risk modeling simulations are not perfect. Far, far, far from it. Can you actually predict infection for an individual in a room with an unknown potential aerosol? No, you cannot. You have to make a bunch of assumptions and classify situations into risk categories. But compared to, do negative pressure no matter what, or let's do 12 air changes because that's what Grandpa did, this is a quantum leap forward in terms of defensibility and having an engineering framework. And it's also very practical. It establishes an infection risk management mode, IRMM, also called pandemic mode. I like to call it pandemic mode, so that you don't have to do those ventilation rates all the time. And it uses a clean air per person specification for different space types. So for patient rooms, if you're short on clean air to meet ASHRAE 241, you just put the HEPA filter in the room and you're done. A lot of patient rooms, by the way, 300 square foot single patient room with more than 4 or 6 air changes per hour and MER 14 filters. You don't have to do anything. You're basically already in pandemic mode, and you've been in pandemic mode the whole time, which begs the other question. Should we really be running entire hospitals worth of patient rooms at pandemic mode ventilation rates all the time? Is that a smart way to spend energy here on planet Earth? Or is that a smart way to spend money in US healthcare? So now we come to the present stuff. And what I hope is a turning point. So in early 2018, ASHRAE commissioned a research project to identify spaces in Standard 170 and determine their healthcare unique contaminants and generation conditions, and evaluate whether Standard 62.1's ventilation rate procedure could be applied or adapted to determine ventilation rates for those spaces. So this project started in 2018. The methodology was that the project team did a bunch of interviews with clinicians and facility staff. They did a systematic literature review, and then one group, the Stanford group, prepared this task-based analysis of aerosol contaminants and the ventilation needs according to those aerosol contaminants. This report is not out yet, but the conclusions have already been presented at ASHRAE at TC 9.6. And there's basically 2 big conclusions. The first one, we're overventilating. Like, we're overventilating a lot of spaces with outside air. For outside air, 20 of the spaces might be underventilated, but 66% of the spaces are likely overventilated. That's with outside air. Outside air is always the smaller number. Once you include total air, then the total air delivered to the space exceeds the ventilation requirements in 85% of spaces. And that's saying it nicely. It exceeds it by a lot in a lot of those cases. The second big conclusion here is that is no surprise, air changes per hour are the wrong metric. The conclusion in this report says in pretty clear terms, occupant-based contaminants are never a function of room volume. Process contaminants are never a function of room volume. Infectious aerosols are never a function of room volume. So air changes per hour based on room volume is just technically incorrect for an air quality or contaminant-based standard, right? So ASHRAE, the organization that now owns and publishes this healthcare ventilation standard going on 20 years, also has an internal report that categorically says that the standard is wrong. We're overventilating, so we're wasting energy, and we're using the wrong metric, air changes per hour. So this project recommends ripping out the air change table, at least most of it, and replacing it with a person and area-based system that in practice is going to look a whole lot like Standard 62. So what should healthcare ventilation look like? What we should wind up with is a new set of tables. And nobody has those tables because nobody's really started working on them in any real way. But if they follow the recommendations in this research, it should go down roughly like this. First off, you're going to have some rooms, some critical rooms, operating rooms, cesarean delivery rooms, isolation rooms, protected environments, things like that, where the outside air formulas were changed. We'll use the 62 methodology for determining outside air, but the room will still have some overall requirements for total ventilation and for filtration, right? Then we're going to have a good number of spaces that are exhausted. They're just flat out exhausted spaces, restrooms, janitor's closets, dirty laundry room, but we also have like autopsy rooms and body holding rooms, right? And so those spaces are just going to be driven by the exhaust. Some of them don't require any outside air. If they do require outside air, then that would be set up by the standard 62 style calculation. Some of those, by the way, will switch units to CFM per square foot or CFM per toilet, which is how standard 62 is written. Some of them might stay air changes. And then the rest of the spaces, the lion's share of spaces really fall into this, what you see on the bottom left there, the other rooms, right? Storage rooms, treatment rooms, examination rooms, patient rooms, all the other types of rooms. Those are going to fall into sets of categories that we know from standard 62. So we'll have our outside air calculations set by those. The outside air calculations will be the ventilation that's needed for contamination control, and there won't be an additional total air change requirement on top of that. Same as it is for schools and churches and all the other spaces, the way that we do them in standard 62. And all of the outside air from all of those different calculations will feed into our system level calculations the same way they do in other buildings, right? So whether it's a single space HVAC system or a multiple space methodology, the so-called multi-space equation of standard 62, there's also some correction factors that you'd take there, time diversity, occupant diversity, things like that. All of that would apply the same as we already know within our standard 62 ventilation rate procedure. And then finally, off to the side, you'd have pandemic mode. You shouldn't always be ventilating for infectious aerosols. There might be some rooms where you should always be ventilating for infectious aerosols, but in most rooms you shouldn't always be ventilating for infectious aerosols. But when you do, you need to know what it is. And so that is where ASHRAE 241 would kick into gear. And so with that, we would have a new standard for healthcare ventilation, right? So when is this going to happen? Well, see, ASHRAE 170, like all of the ASHRAE Standards Committee, is a consensus standard. The best way I've ever heard it described is we put 20 national experts in the room, and if 2/3 of them vote for it, then it's probably a good idea. And that sounds pretty good, unless those 20 experts have ossified into groupthink, unless that group sees itself as a group of people who have self-selected over 20 years and they see their job as the defenders of the air change standard, right? I'm not one of the 20 experts, by the way. I don't have a vote. One of my bosses likes to introduce me at conferences and say that Travis Inglis knows more about healthcare ventilation than anyone in the US, which may be true. If it is true, it didn't happen with my consent. But I'm also not somebody who's ever been invited into a voting seat on the committee for good reason. If I had a vote on this committee, I would have been sitting there for the last 5 years or 10 years saying, no, the standard is wrong. No, the standard is wrong. No, the standard is wrong. Nobody wants that guy on the committee, the guy that always votes no on everything, which is to say that the 20 people who do have votes on that committee are all people who are very used to playing nice with the air change per hour standard, which is to say that when the proposal comes in to start doing something different from air changes per hour, they may look a little bit more like the group that we see on one side of this screen versus the group that we see on the other side of the screen. I do think that this is the lesson of the story. Healthcare ventilation is not just a technical problem. We kind of lost sight of it as a technical problem. So I think now healthcare ventilation is a case study of what happens when your standards become divorced from their own technical relevance, right? Our air change table that we have is technically indefensible, but it has this authority that it's gained from longevity. And that authority that it's gained from longevity is not going to be kind of easy to just break up. Or it may not be easy to break up. It may not be easy to see that go another way. But we are at that crossroads now, I think, in this year, this next 3 years or something like that. We have the data, we have the tools, we have an internal research project that gives us a pretty clear-cut choice. We can act on what the research is telling us and create a new paradigm for healthcare ventilation for the generation moving forward. Or we can keep going with the air change table and do that for another, 100 years or something like that. Thanks for your time.